Hi, listeners.
Hello. Welcome to the MedInsights Unleashed podcast
With your hosts,
Z
and John.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Good morning, Z. I'm very good. On top of the world. What can I say?
You're always
It's
on
a
top of the world.
Friday.
And has fall set in New Jersey? Because it's set in over here.
The leaves are falling.
Okay.
Winter is approaching. Australians, if it gets below 70 degrees, I'm freezing.
Kenyans, we're exactly the same way. Listen, we're on the equator. We like warm temperatures. I'm ready to hibernate. John, today we have Dr. Oliver Bathe in our recording studio. I met Oliver some time ago in my previous life when I was working in the pharma industry. And it was real pleasure meeting and working with Oliver. I'm just going to hand it over to him so he can introduce himself. And then we have an exciting episode ahead of us around diagnostic testing. Oliver, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Z. And thanks for allowing me to share my story and my ideas. I'm Oliver Bathe. I am a surgical oncologist from the University of Calgary, and my practice was generally focused on treating patients with liver cancer and pancreatic cancer. And in parallel to that, I had a research lab that was focused on developing new tools to help to personalize cancer care. And that essentially was the foundation for the creation of a company called Qualisure Diagnostics.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how your kind of research led into the development of Qualisure Diagnostics and how the diagnostic testing works?
I'll start by telling you why I'm interested in precision oncology, which is essentially the personalization of cancer care. My experience has informed my interest in precision oncology. I've seen countless patients already sick from their cancer, and they're offered this extensive surgery and very toxic chemotherapy without even knowing whether they're going to benefit. Now, clinical trials, what they do is they look at all patients with a particular diagnosis and then determine whether a drug or a treatment is going to be beneficial to the group as a whole. But they never look at what would happen to the individual because they haven't selected patients based on specific features of their cancer. And I guess the other problem is that now we are developing much more effective drugs and many more options.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question to the patient is always, which drug or which treatment do I take? And we need better ways to identify the best treatment options for individuals. It really came to head with me with my own mother who had lung cancer. And the question was whether to proceed with chemotherapy, whether she should get radiation to her brain, and so on. So it's not just an academic interest to me, but it's a real personal interest. And so my research is always focused on trying to develop these tools. Somewhere along the way during my research career, I started collaborating with the Cancer Genome Atlas Project, which is a really large international collaboration where over 10,000 tumors were collected by the National Institutes of Health in the US. And essentially, we created so much information, so much data on the molecular features of cancer. We had to find ways to analyze those data.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that we had in the lab is, how do we find those molecular features that are most biologically informative and clinically most actionable in all of those complex data sets? So what we did is we created a machine learning algorithm that scours very large genomic databases like the Cancer Genome Atlas Project and identifies the molecular features in a cancer that are most closely related to survival outcomes. And that essentially was the foundation of our company because we very rapidly discovered a number of potential tests that could help patients with cancer care.
Can I ask you a question? How does that patient understand that that therapy is going to be specifically good for them from the data that you're gleaning from the NCI database?
Well, importantly, we're not the only ones doing this. There are a whole bunch of different diagnostic test developers that are working on similar sorts of projects, and not always in competition, but often in a complementary way. I'll give you an example. There's a drug for colorectal cancer called cetuximab, and we know people who have the KRAS mutation are not going to respond to that very well. So that is very informative, and alternative treatments can be utilized for that. That's one example. Looking more at the types of tests that we produce through Qualisure, we're really focused right now mostly on prognostic tests. So these are tests that are used after surgery to determine the likelihood that your cancer is going to come back. And if you know that you have a low risk of your cancer recurring after treatment, then you might be able to avoid any further treatments such as, toxic chemotherapy. So it's quite helpful in specific circumstances for that reason.
You mentioned that if you've got a low risk, how does a patient know whether they've got a high risk or a low risk or an intermediate risk? How do you
Stratify
assess that?
or
Yeah.
stratify?
Right now, what is done is we use staging systems to stratify. I'll give you another example from colorectal cancer. If you have disease that's restricted to the colon, then that's a stage 1 or 2. Once it's spread to the lymph nodes, it's called stage 3. And at stage 3, after surgery, you would generally want chemotherapy. Now, the difference with the approach that we're suggesting is that, not all stage 3 cancers are bad. And similarly, not all stage 2 cancers are good. So, if you develop tests that help you to refine that decision, then that's what's going to benefit the patient. And there are a number of tests being developed for that very purpose.
I'm going to just take us back a few steps so that you can kind of walk us through what that journey or pathway looks like. Your team, you utilize an algorithm, right, to scour the molecular features. You were then identified a certain type of cancer, and which cancer are you guys looking at specifically?
Yeah, so we're looking at a number of different cancer types, and mostly what we're focusing on is cases in which there's very actionable information. I'll just go back to your original question: is how does that go to the test design? So, say you were interested in a test for lung cancer, and you want to determine the risk of recurrence after surgery. So you would look at data from a large number of patients with lung cancer who just had surgery. We submit it to our algorithm, which we call HiLifer. And what it does is it provides a list of genes or molecular features, whatever it is that you want to look at, that are most closely and most consistently related to recurrence. And with that list of genes, then we have to find the pattern of expression of genes that will help us to more specifically determine whether you have a subtype of cancer that's high risk or not. With our thyroid cancer, which is a test that's currently on the market, it's a test that consists of 82 genes.
Okay.
We look at the pattern of those 82 genes that are most closely related to recurrence. And then as a result of looking at those patterns, we've identified 3 molecular subtypes with different patterns. And this one pattern, which we call type 3, has a very high risk of recurrence. So that's a subgroup of patients where you would want to treat them more aggressively. On the other hand, the patients who have a very low risk of cancer, because they have a low risk subtype, you could treat them with something that is much less toxic, much less impactful, associated with fewer complications, and preserving the patient's quality of life. So that's the reason that's the way that we discover these tests and design these tests.
If we're talking about thyroid cancer, and many of these people have a very, very early surgical resection. On that surgical resection where you get a partial or a total, depending on the disease state and how aggressive it is in the thyroid, you then would do an analysis to see if gene types, biomarkers would designate that patient's therapy. Is that
Yeah,
what
you
I'm
can
saying?
certainly do it with surgical samples, but the best use case for that thyroid test that I told you, and we call it Thyroid Guide PX, the best use case is when a patient is initially diagnosed with thyroid cancer. Typically, somebody with a thyroid nodule will have an ultrasound and subsequently will have a biopsy. And once the pathologist looks at the biopsy under the microscope and determines that it's a cancer, you can take those very same cells and submit them to molecular testing with Thyroid Guide PX. That's when you really want to know whether it's a high-risk cancer or not, because it informs the entire treatment pathway. What kind of surgery are you going to do? Are you going to remove all of the thyroid gland or part of the thyroid? Or could you even observe that person? I think is probably the most impactful use case for that particular test.
I'm interested for the simple reason is that the family member has thyroid cancer. Normally if they do a test, they test whether the thyroid is hot or cold, and they give them
Right.
131. Would this test be done before the radioactive iodine? Would you do it before then, or
Yeah,
you would have to be done it very, very early?
You would ideally do the test as soon as the diagnosis is made, because then it informs you on the entire treatment pathway. Again, looking at a high risk papillary thyroid cancer, which is the most common cancer of the thyroid, you would have total thyroidectomy. And at that point, subsequently, you can decide whether to give radioactive iodine.
And why did you and your team choose thyroid cancer? Because yes, in terms of out of the thyroid cancers, because you have 3 different types. You have the papillary, the medullary, and I think anaplastic. Papillary is most common and has the best prognosis. But there are so many other types of cancers. For example, you mentioned lung cancer. So again, increasing incidence. And yes, there's a lot of target therapies, immunotherapies. But why did you guys pick thyroid cancer over other cancers to initially look at?
Yeah, so a number of reasons. First thing is that thyroid surgeons and endocrinologists that we knew personally told us that they needed a test to help them to refine decision making. So we were addressing an unmet clinical need. The other reason is that, we're a new company and we wanted to have a most efficient way to getting to the market. And it's a niche market. There are only so many thyroid surgeons and endocrinologists. They're highly specialized, and so it's relatively easy to engage with them and hopefully to create adoption. The final reason is that the incidence of thyroid cancer is increasing very significantly. In the US and Canada, for example, it's increasing by 6% per year, and it's similarly increasing by that rate in many other countries. And then there are some countries that are screening for thyroid cancer where the incidence has gone up very, very markedly. And an example of that would be in South Korea. So there's definitely a need for a situation where more and more people are being diagnosed with this disease, and there needs to be clarity on how best to treat that.
Okay. John, do you have because I'm looking at John and I can see the wheels turning.
Well, I've been in thyroid cancer since 2005 with pharmaceutical agents and treating thyroid cancer. And you're right, it's unstated disease. And in the days that when we were talking about thyroid cancer in the early days, the term was used as it was a good cancer to have. And just let the listeners know, no cancer is a good cancer to have, especially with thyroid cancer, because as Z said, there's medullary, there's anaplastic, which is still one of the most aggressive tumors and most resistant to chemotherapy and immune therapy even today. Papillary is on the rise globally, as Oliver had just said, and we don't know why. There are several reasons that they think that there could be, but that would be for another discussion. And having a test that Oliver is bringing out to actually diagnose post-surgery is amazing to me. So my wife, she had the biopsy, then we had the radioactive iodine 131 test, and then you've got to isolate it. Then you've got to wait for the results, and then you go for the surgery, and then you've got to keep monitoring. And if you lose your thyroid, you're on Synthroid for the rest of your life, and that is exceedingly difficult for patients. This is a very passionate thing for me.
Yeah, John, I think you bring up some really important points. And one of them is exactly as you pointed out, clinicians often say, that this is the good cancer. And when you talk to patients, and I was just recently at a meeting with THICA, which is Thyroid Cancer Patient Advocacy Group. And what I heard over and over again was that that is a very significant irritation to patients. They feel very invalidated by that because to them, the cancer diagnosis is extremely stressful. And then you present them with all of these treatment options, and they're confused. They don't know what to do, and they don't know who to believe. What is the best treatment? So, providing them with some kind of clarity with a molecular test, I think is really going to be a significant positive impact to these patients.
Oliver, the question I had was with regards to your specific thyroid test right now, how many patients have you been able, I'm assuming it's been validated. So kind of what are your numbers looking like right now? What kind of success rates have you seen? And the other question is, sorry, I ask a lot of questions. If patients want to access, how do they go about accessing this and how do they get more information about it as well? Both patients and clinicians. A lot.
Yeah, so this test the discovery was based on over 350 patients, and then subsequently we validated this in 3 separate groups, one from the US and Canada, another from Korea, and subsequently another one from Canada. So it's been validated a number of instances, and we continue to try to refine it and improve on it. It's really early on in the adoption phase. We're trying to engage with key opinion leaders who would be interested in helping us to bring this forward and to study it. Patients are very, very interested in this, and they reach out to us all the time. I would say that the major obstacle to that right now is that clinicians haven't adopted it in a big way yet. And so that's where we're at right now, is just trying to create the interest in the clinician community. I was going to say you can actually go to our website, qualisure and you can find out more information about Thyroid Guide PX. And certainly there's a capability to reach out to us through that website as well.
Health authorities want targeted therapy and they want earlier diagnosis, especially on a disease that's growing globally at 6% per year, which is pretty amazing, really. How do you get the funding or the support
Yeah.
for a listing, not only approval, that's not going to give patients access, but how does the health authorities give grants to actually support the use of this diagnostic test?
Yeah, it is a serious uphill battle to create adoption for new technologies. First of all, you have to continue to create evidence that will help clinicians to decide whether this is something that is valid. In parallel to that, once you have sufficient clinical evidence, getting into guidelines. And the other parallel process that needs to be addressed is really insurance coverage and convincing insurers that this is something that clinicians want and clinicians find valid is something that takes years, as a matter of fact. So really, it's all about finding leaders, key opinion leaders who are willing to give it a try and to study it and to hopefully influence in a positive way colleagues. So that's something that takes many years, as you can imagine.
And you actually mentioned something. You stated that there's been some kind of pushback or from the clinician standpoint, but here's a diagnostic testing that, to your point, post-surgery it's precision medicine, right? And that's all the focus right now. So why such a pushback from like the clinician group? Because it could really help, to your point, precisely identify whether a patient needs to get exposed to certain types of chemotherapy, the toxicity, then there's a cost behind it. So why the resistance?
Yeah, I don't think it's a pushback. I wouldn't actually. I mean, maybe for some people it's a pushback, but for most clinicians, they are interested in this. They would entertain the data, and they would. I guess it just takes people a while to make a decision whether to try these new technologies. There are definitely people who are not interested in this kind of thing, and I would say those are people who routinely do a total thyroidectomy.
Mhm.
But clinicians who are interested in de-intensifying the treatment, doing things that are a little more conservative, those are really the ones that I think would mostly be interested by this. I think it's just one of those things that requires time and continued evidence gathering.
I was just going to say, from an advocacy perspective, how does the group support you advocating to doctors on patients' behalf? How do we gather that momentum for these patients with thyroid cancer?
Well, definitely, I think that there is a role for advocacy from groups like THICA. On the other hand, I think that THICA needs to be careful about, you know, sponsoring, so to speak, pharma or diagnostic testing company. And so it's a fine line that has to be drawn for THICA and those related patient advocacy groups.
I'm glad you said that.
And are there other competitors, like, within the same space as you guys? Or because you mentioned originally, I mean, there are are there other competitors within the same space?
Yeah, so for the thyroid cancer test, there are a number of different molecular tests that are really focused on determining whether an indeterminate nodule is cancer or not. So that's what those tests were built for.
Okay.
They are sometimes being applied for the same purpose of thyroid guide PX, but have not been validated for that. Really, this is what makes this test special, is really that it's specifically engineered for papillary thyroid cancer and has been supported by data from well over 800 patients now. And, I do know also that there are competitors coming down the line because this is of great interest to the thyroid cancer community.
The follicular adenoma, how does that fit into the diagnostics versus a differentiated papillary tumor?
So for an adenoma, it's a benign entity.
Yes.
So in terms of the different types of papillary or different types of thyroid cancer, there is papillary, follicular, there's a Hürthle cell tumor, which is not very common, and medullary, as well as anaplastic. So anaplastic is by far the worst type of thyroid cancer. It's not something that would be, in that case, molecular testing really is geared towards determining whether there are any targets there for drugs. And that certainly our test wouldn't be appropriate for that kind of situation. Similarly, our test is not focused on follicular or medullary or Hürthle cell because we just don't have sufficient data for that. When we create a test using our algorithm, we need data from well over 200 or 300 patients, depending on how aggressive the cancer is. We just don't have sufficient data from follicular or Hürthle cell or medullary to create a test.
It's a shame in many ways because when you look at tissue generation and capture in the Southeast Asia quadrant and in China, it's almost mandated that, you're capturing tumor all the time and you're putting it into a database. It surprises me that in the United States and in other countries, we get the approval from the patient to do it, but yet the data capture and the tissue capture compared to overseas is lower. Is that because of patients resistant to give it away?
Well, I have a biobank and I've had one since 2004. And when you ask patients for consent for biobanks, they are 99% supportive because they want to impact on the outcomes related to cancer. So that's honestly that's the least of anyone's problems. But I think that, what we're talking about really when you're looking at medullary and follicular and anaplastic is they're relatively rare cancers. So finding a collection that is totally focused on that with sufficient numbers is difficult. And then I guess the other problem related to biobanking is that oftentimes the biobanks don't have the outcomes data. So with our biobank, we've been really careful about analyzing all of the outcomes, including complications and including survival outcomes. Whereas there are many tissue repositories that you have no idea whether the patients lived a long time or lived a short time.
So what are the kind of next steps? Where is this test available? I think you mentioned Canada and the US, if I'm not
Yeah, so Thyroid Guide PX currently available in the US and in Canada. And we're early on in our clinical adoption, but we're seeing some very significant interest from thyroid surgeons and endocrinologists at this time.
Okay.
And we are now also reaching out to Asia. I was recently at Singapore and there was significant interest there as well.
Mm.
And my hope is that we're going to be able to disseminate this technology internationally.
Yeah, what we probably need here, or you need, is a cooperative group trial, right?
No, I don't think so.
Mm.
I think that prospective trials are definitely helpful. We are expecting, well, we have a clinical trial right now happening at the University of Calgary that is prospective. And then we are planning another trial at University of Toronto and at Kaiser Permanente. So there are trials that are coming down the pipes. Really, I would say that the most impactful immediate outcome that you can expect from those trials is whether this is changing clinical management. But the survival outcomes take a long time to come out when you're looking at
Yes,
prospective trials, as you know.
Yeah.
especially in thyroid cancer, because you can live a long time,
Yeah, for sure.
And
which
do you
is
have
great news for the patient.
it is. No, it is. So are there plans to kind of ramp this up or and looking into other types of cancer?
Yep, for sure. We already have a pipeline of different tests. Actually, our next test that will be ready to go out is another thyroid cancer test. We call it RAI Guide PX. Not quite ready for prime time, but essentially the purpose of that test is to determine whether you're likely to be sensitive or resistant to radioactive iodine.
Okay.
And then we have two lung cancer tests, one for adenocarcinoma and one for squamous cell carcinoma. And those are prognostic tests to help make decisions on whether you need chemotherapy after surgery. And then we have a colorectal cancer test and a head and neck cancer test. Yeah, colorectal cancer really is for the same purpose, and is to determine whether you need adjuvant chemotherapy after surgery. And then the head and neck cancer test is focused on trying to find individuals where you can treat them less aggressively with less disfiguring treatments.
So your surgical expertise went into pancreatic cancer, right? Which is another highly active, very aggressive disease. How are you doing tests for that? And what do you hope to gain for the patients that maybe have friends or on this call today or know of people with pancreatic cancer, because it's still one of the most aggressive, deadly diseases we face today.
Yeah, exactly. So
Good
the,
question.
the use case for precision oncology is very different in pancreatic cancer. So what I described up to this point were prognostic biomarkers to determine whether or not to treat. For pancreatic cancer, we know it is all aggressive. So prognostic biomarkers aren't going to be very helpful in that instance. Rather, what we need, now that we have several treatment options for pancreas cancer, is tests that help to determine on the best treatment option for those individuals. So you don't waste your time on a chemotherapy that is not going to be beneficial and just going to make you sick, but you're focused on a chemotherapy that is more likely to give you benefit. So that's where I think pancreas cancer is going, and I know that many people are working on that particular project.
Are you guys doing it?
No, not at this time. We have, as you know, we're a small company, so we have to focus on on particular things, but we are collaborating with other people who are doing that.
Okay. It's good for patients to know.
Yeah, 100%.
In the interest of time as well, we may just have to come to a point and ask you, Oliver, for the patients and the caregivers that are listening out there, what are some kind of key takeaways that you wanted to impart and share with them so that they can get better informed and or, be able to access the test, not only for the thyroid test, but for future ones as well?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, I would like to signal to patients that the community is on it. Everybody recognizes the need to personalize cancer care. There are many tests being produced and will come out in the market over the next number of years that will help to define the best treatment for patients. So I do see that coming, but the adoption process is a long one. So, and in terms of the thyroid cancer test, the best way to access the test would be to speak with your doctor, advocate for the test. You can also contact us directly. We visit our website, www.qualisure.dx.com, or email me at obathe@qualisure.dx.com.
Great. Well, thank you. And we'll add the additional information in our notes as well for the podcast. So thank you very much for that. John, as always, this has been really interesting. Again, I learn from every single episode that we hold. And I think that this is the first episode we've discussed with regards to prognostic testing, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's exciting. I hate using that word because it's overused, definitely, but it gives a lot of hope for people with cancer at the moment, that there is a great deal of research going on to even prevent it before it even major decisions are made about treatments, and give guidance to treatments is amazing. Thank you, Oliver, for all the research your team is doing on behalf of the patients, and we wish you really a lot of luck in the future, that you can expedite this to the market and give patients access is the key.
Well, thank you very much, John and Zee, for letting me share my story and sharing our ideas. And thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. All right. Have a good one. Great weekend.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Ciao.
MedInsights Unleashed disclaimers. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered healthcare advice in any way. The podcast is not intended to replace professional medical advice. The use of the information and material linked to the podcast is at the user's own risk. MedInsights Unleashed is not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of the podcast. Importantly, please consult your healthcare provider for individualized guidance and treatment. Thank you, and we look forward to you being with us on the next MedInsights Unleashed podcast.